Welcome back to this video series on the Cambridge capital controversy for modern economists. In this video, we're going to talk about reswitching and reverse capital deepening. Now recall, the Cambridge capital controversy was critical of the belief that there was an inverse relationship between capital and interest rate. Switching occurs where we move from one recipe of producing a fixed output to another. If we have a capital-intensive method and a labor-intensive method for producing some specific amount of output, we'll use the capital-intensive method when the interest rate is low and labor-intensive method when it is going to be high. Now, this is nothing special. Reswitching is where we have the following situation, where we start out using a capital-intensive method when our interest rate is going to be low, move over to our labor-intensive method as we go and increase that interest rate, then back to our capital-intensive method. Now, it's important to note when we're talking about production processes here, the critique of reswitching primarily goes on production processes which are dynamic, though we're going to go and see this with reference to static production processes as well. Now, a dynamic production process in this context is going to refer to a sequence of how the factors of production are going to be used and subsequently when our firms are going to pay for them. When we pay our capital is not going to be the same time for when we pay our workers' wages in the context of dynamic production processes. So the space of the analysis where we need to think about switching and reswitching is going to be in the context of this factor price space. And we're going to talk about this thing known as the factor price frontier, and we're going to be drawing these lines which are going to think about the combination of input prices, in this case wages and interest rate, that keep our costs the same if we're using a particular technique. And again, technique just means recipe here. Now, in a two-dimensional case, our wages are going to be on our vertical axis and our interest rate or our price of capital is going to be on our horizontal axis. The technique that we're using here is that we're producing some output with 2 units of labor and 1 unit of capital, and the level curve is going to be defined by this function here below. Now, suppose we have 2 possible techniques. So 2 different recipes for going and producing a fixed level of output. Under technique number 1, we have 2 units of labor and 1 unit of capital. And under technique number 2, we have 1 unit of labor and 2 units of capital. This outer envelope is going to be our factor price frontier. And this kink is where we switch from technique 1 to technique 2. Now, the factor price frontier represents the combinations of wages and price of capital that keep our costs constant. Now, if our capital is paid with interest over several periods, we're going to have curvature in our factor price frontier. And we can see that this is going to be the case where, again, we are paying our labor immediately, but we don't pay for capital right away. Rather, we pay it with compound interest after T periods. That's what's going to go and generate some curvature in this space. Now, it's possible with dynamic production processes that we have a situation where we can move from a capital-intensive production process to a labor-intensive process, which is given by point alpha, and back to our capital-intensive one, which is given by point beta. Now, this is going to be the classic case of reswitching, where we're moving from a capital-intensive method to a labor-intensive method, and back to our capital-intensive method as we're going and increasing our interest rate. Now, instead of looking at techniques, we're going to be looking at production functions. And an example that we're going to go and consider is with reference to a firm having the following production function. It's a little bit awkward here, but they're essentially looking to go and choose whichever technique is going to give them the higher level of output at a fixed price. And this outer envelope shows the profit the firm makes at each level of capital utilization. Switching and reswitching of production is going to occur at points Ka and Kb. Now, it's important to remember, firms seek to maximize profit. So it does not tell us what technique the firm is going to choose, but rather it's going to tell us the range of capital inputs where one production function goes and dominates another. Now, this example can be used explicitly to illustrate the non-monotone relationship between our rate of return on our capital, R, or our interest rate, and capital utilization, K. Now, we're going to note that This curve is derived by our standard rule of where our firm goes and optimally allocates capital, where our marginal product of capital is going to be interest equal to our interest rate or our price of capital. And again, this is just normalizing where our price of output is going to be equal to 1. And we can actually see this jump in our demand curve for capital. This jump is exactly what reverse capital deepening is. So we've gone through reswitching, we've illustrated this, but now let's give some clear definitions before we go and wrap up. We talked about capital deepening, which is going to refer to the increase in our capital labor ratio. And a higher capital labor ratio is associated with a lower interest rate traditionally. Reverse capital deepening is going to refer to a case where our capital labor ratio increases while our interest rate is going to go up and increases. So that's all reverse capital deepening goes and means. Now, I'm going to throw in this point just as a bonus. Sometimes we talk about capital widening, which is going to be a situation where our firm will go and increase its capital investment, but that's going to be coupled with an increase in labor, so our capital per worker does not go and change. So I hope this gives some more clarity on this idea of reswitching, switching, and reverse capital deepening. I'll see you in the next video where we're going to talk about what the impact of the Cambridge Capital controversy was, and maybe some of the lack of impact it goes and has, and some pragmatic reasons for as to why that is the case. So I'll see you guys there. Take care.